The hospital room was supposed to be a place of joy, a safe haven where new mother Jasmine Carter could rest with her newborn twins. But something felt off. The nurse assigned to her, a woman with cold eyes and a forced smile, kept lingering too long, asking too many questions. Jasmine brushed off the uneasy feeling until the nurse did something that made her heart stop. The woman had the twins in her arms, cooing at them, but instead of gently placing them back in the bassinet, she turned toward the door. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. "Where are you taking my babies?" she demanded, struggling to sit up despite the exhaustion weighing her down. The nurse hesitated, then forced a reassuring grin. "Just a routine check," she said too quickly. But Jasmine knew better. Something wasn't right. Panic surged through her veins as she reached for her phone with trembling fingers. There was only one person who could fix this in an instant: her husband. Within seconds, the hospital doors burst open and a deep, commanding voice echoed down the hallway. "Put those babies down. Now." The room froze. The police chief had arrived. The nurse stiffened, her grip tightening on the babies for just a second too long. Jasmine's heart pounded as she locked eyes with her husband, Chief Daniel Carter, standing tall in his uniform. His presence was powerful, commanding, and in that moment, the entire room seemed to shrink under the weight of his authority. The nurse hesitated, her face paling. I was just taking them for a routine check," she stammered, her voice now shaking. But Daniel wasn't buying it. He stepped forward, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. "You don't move another inch," he said, his voice low and firm. Jasmine's hands trembled as she reached out for her babies. The nurse reluctantly placed them back in the bassinet, but something about her expression sent a chill through Jasmine. There was no apology, no fear, just something calculating, something that made Jasmine realize this wasn't a misunderstanding. The room was silent except for the soft cries of the twins. Daniel turned to his wife, his jaw clenched. "Jasmine, did you request this nurse?" She shook her head, swallowing the lump in her throat. "No, I've never seen her before." Daniel's expression darkened. "Then we have a problem." Jasmine clutched her babies close, her breath shaky as she watched Daniel's eyes narrow at the nurse. The room felt colder now, the tension thick. He reached for his radio, his voice steady but sharp. "I need hospital security in maternity. Now." The nurse's expression flickered, a flash of something unreadable crossing her face. Then, just as quickly, she dropped her shoulders, forcing a nervous smile. "Chief Carter, this is all a misunderstanding," she said lightly, though her voice wavered. "I was only following protocol." Daniel took a slow step forward, his presence unshakable. "Really? Because protocol doesn't involve sneaking newborns out of a mother's room without explanation." He glanced at Jasmine, his jaw tightening. "And it sure doesn't involve lying." Jasmine's stomach churned. The nurse was too calm, too rehearsed, as if she had done this before. She clutched her twins tighter, her motherly instincts screaming that something wasn't right. "Who sent you?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The nurse hesitated, just for a second. Then, before anyone could react, she turned on her heel and bolted for the door. Daniel was faster. His hand gripped her wrist in an instant, his voice sharp. "Oh no, you're not going anywhere." The nurse struggled against Daniel's grip, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Let me go, you're making a mistake," she hissed, but Daniel's hold didn't waver. His eyes burned with a quiet fury, his instincts screaming that this was bigger than just one desperate act. Jasmine sat frozen, her heart racing as she clutched her twins protectively. Something about the nurse's reaction wasn't right. She wasn't pleading or explaining, just trying to escape. That meant one thing: she had something to hide. The door burst open, and 2 hospital security guards rushed in. "Chief Carter, what's going on?" one of them asked, glancing between the nurse and the terrified mother on the hospital bed. Daniel didn't loosen his grip. "This woman was attempting to take my children without authorization," he said, his voice sharp. "She needs to be detained until we figure out exactly what's going on." The nurse's face twisted with something between anger and fear. "You don't understand," she muttered. "It's not what you think." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. "Then explain," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The nurse opened her mouth, but before she could say a word, the hospital alarm blared, cutting through the room like a knife. The blaring alarm sent shockwaves through the room. Jasmine's pulse quickened as she instinctively held her babies closer, her eyes darting to Daniel. He was already reaching for his radio, his jaw clenched. "Who set off that alarm?" he barked at the security guards. One of them pressed his earpiece, listening intently. "Code red in maternity." "Unauthorized personnel in the wing," he relayed, his face darkening. Jasmine's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. Someone was here, someone who didn't belong. The nurse, still locked in Daniel's grip, suddenly smirked. It was brief, but Jasmine saw it. Her breath hitched. This woman wasn't panicked. She was stalling. Before anyone could react, the overhead lights flickered, plunging the hospital into dim emergency lighting. The twins whimpered in Jasmine's arms, their tiny faces scrunching in distress. Daniel tightened his grip. "Who are you working with?" he demanded. The nurse exhaled, her confidence slipping just a bit. "You're too late," she muttered. Jasmine's stomach knotted. Too late for what? Then, in the hallway, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed toward them. Heavy, purposeful, and getting closer. Daniel positioned himself between Jasmine and the door, his stance firm. The heavy footsteps were almost at the threshold now, the tension in the room suffocating. Jasmine gripped the twins protectively, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Then the door burst open. A man in scrubs rushed in, his expression tight with urgency. But it wasn't concern in his eyes, it was something darker. He barely glanced at Daniel before locking eyes with the nurse. "We have to go, now." Daniel didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he drew his gun. "Hands where I can see them." The man froze, his hands halfway to his pockets, his jaw clenched. The nurse, still restrained, let out a frustrated breath. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she muttered. Jasmine felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just one road nurse. This was planned. Security swarmed in, blocking the only exit. The man in scrubs shifted, then, without warning, lunged toward Jasmine. Daniel fired. The shot rang out, striking the man's shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor. The nurse screamed, twisting desperately in Daniel's grip. "You don't get it. Those babies." Jasmine held her breath. "What?" The nurse's eyes burned with something close to desperation. "They were never supposed to be yours." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her grip tightening on her babies. The nurse's face twisted with frustration. "You weren't supposed to keep them. They belong to." Daniel cut her off. "Enough." His voice was firm, unshaken. He motioned for security. "Get them both in custody, now." The guards moved in, restraining the man on the floor while another took the nurse from Daniel's grip. Even as they were led away, Jasmine could still hear the nurse muttering under her breath, something about a plan, about people in high places. But Jasmine didn't care. She looked at Daniel, her eyes wide and brimming with emotion. "What just happened?" she whispered. Daniel exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Someone tried to take our babies, but they failed." His eyes softened as he stepped closer, wrapping a protective arm around her. "They're safe now. That's what matters." Jasmine finally let out the breath she'd been holding. She looked down at her twins, their tiny faces peaceful despite the chaos. Whatever the truth was, whoever had been behind this, none of it mattered now. Because her family was together, and no one was ever taking them away.